So it's Labor Day in the United States, and I figure what better thing to do than to argue against child labor laws, because that is how you upset lots of people. Now, I know a bunch of people are already super angry and will get super emotional about this because, granted, this is a very emotional topic. We're talking about child labor here. In many cases, this is the equivalent of child abuse. But hold on, like you have to put the emotion aside to all this, because there's a lot of situations where, like, all the bad things in the world, we can say that a significant chunk of the bad things in the world are bad people. They don't care how, are bad people putting forward bad ideas that support them and hurt others. They're fully aware it hurts others. They don't care. They just want what they want, and they don't care who they hurt. Now, a lot of other things, unfortunately, a lot of other problems caused in this world are caused by people that mean well and advocate things that seem so obviously good that they don't actually check to see if they actually do good. They're just like, well, obviously this is good, especially on the very emotional topics. They don't actually check. But nice for us, there are people actually out there that do check these things. So on the topic of child labor, this is something I heard about a few years ago and have been reading into over the last few years, and only just now actually sat down and was like, okay, I got to read this. I got to read this report in depth. So, child labor. When it comes to child labor laws, we can't actually tell if they help the children. I mean, over this entire world, there are certainly situations where laws that stop children from working are good, and other situations when they're bad. But you have to look at this at a case-by-case basis. So the whole thing I wanted to show everyone, to tell everyone about, was Bangladesh, which you probably haven't heard about. The situation in Bangladesh, it's kind of known for having lots and lots of child workers, like a lot. And so this was something that has been being discussed for decades. If you search like Bangladesh child labor, you'll have articles talking about how bad it is just from like a year or two ago. But this whole debate, this whole discussion has been going back for decades. And this report I'm referencing here from UNICEF is actually from 1997. Now, what happened back then was the U.S. government thought about, hey, what if we try to introduce some legislation that basically says, Bangladesh, a lot of the stuff you're importing to us was made with child labor. So what if we pass a law that basically says if it was made with child labor, we are not buying it. The U.S. people from the U.S. cannot buy products from Bangladesh if they're made with child labor. Essentially, that is a red flag to any company or any organization that relies on child labor. Now, again, I'm not necessarily defending child labor. It's one of those things where you have to ask yourself, compared to what? Like, that's the biggest question. Compared to what? And that's what people misunderstand. It's like, okay, well, I mean, what's better than child labor, we should say. Not child labor. What's better than child labor? Children going to school, children learning, children doing what they want, children relaxing and playing and having fun with their lives. And we can say, what's worse than child labor? Well, child prostitution, starvation, death. So we can say there are actually things worse than child labor, and that we want to go in the right direction. So the reason I bring these up, especially those three bad things, is because I just mentioned that law that they considered introducing but never actually did. And when the companies in Bangladesh, like the sweatshops and that employed child labor, they heard about this and were like, oh, if this law gets passed, we're going to lose like most of our revenue. Most of the people that buy stuff from us will stop buying from us because we pay children 50 cents a day to work 8-hour days in factories, like making clothing and other things like that. So what they did was they fired all their children. A lot of these companies just went up and was like, okay, we can't have children here. It is better for us to hire regular adult workers. So they fired all the children. Now, again, you might think, hey, these companies are no longer hiring children. That is a good thing. But again, compared to what? So UNICEF, what they did was they actually went and they followed these children. They said, okay, let's find these children that used to work in factories, and let's follow them and see what happened to them. Let's examine their lives and see if they got better or if they got worse. And if you can tell already, the point of this video, they did not get better. And that is because generally, you have to think about it. Like, say you live in Bangladesh. Put yourself in the shoes of those parents. Why are they putting their children to work? Now, granted, it's entirely possible that some of them are just like, well, I mean, we have a child. The child, we're paying for the child to eat and live, and I don't really care about the well-being of my child, so we're gonna send them off to a factory, and that way they can work, and that way they can do their fair share. There's probably some parents that think that, but I would imagine that a lot of the parents really were like, yeah, I'd rather not put my kid into working in a factory. I'd rather spend time with them. I'd rather enjoy life with them. I'd rather they be happy. I want what's best for my child. I imagine a lot of parents probably want what's best for their child, regardless of where they live on Earth. So that's the thing. Why are these children working in factories? Now, the reason for that is generally because these nations are so incredibly poor. The amount of wealth and it's that these nations just cannot afford. These parents cannot afford to raise a child without having them work. Because when you think of child labor, you think of people working in factories. You think of young 6-year-old kids working in factories for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. There's a chance they could lose a limb or get injured. But of course, we usually think of that in the context of the Industrial Revolution. Well, it's not like things were better before the Industrial Revolution. Things were better with the Industrial Revolution afterwards. The only difference was instead of working in a factory for 10 hours a day, you were working on a farm for 16 hours a day, all day from when you woke up from when you went to bed. You were working on farms just to pull through. Kids were always working in the past. And thank God we live in a society, or at least in the Western world and certain Eastern nations, thank God we live in worlds where with enough wealth and prosperity, where we don't have to put our children to work, where generally they can go to school, get an education, and things are pretty great. But again, I want to run through this Bangladesh or through this UNICEF report, which followed the children around. Now I'm just going to read the one paragraph, showing basically the results of when they followed them. Again, I'll leave the full link in the description to the full report. The consequences for the dismissed children and their parents were not anticipated. The children may have been freed, but at the same time they were trapped in a harsh environment with no skills, little or no education, and precious few alternatives. Schools were either inaccessible, useless, or costly. A series of follow-up visits by UNICEF, local non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and the International Labor Organization, ILO, discovered that children went looking for new sources of income and found them in work such as stone crushing, street hustling, and prostitution. All of them more hazardous and exploitative than garment production. In several cases, the mothers of dismissed children had to leave their jobs in order to look after their children. So, it's quite obvious what happened there. Lots of bad things. Now they proposed another plan, which is to basically try to wean it off slowly. They basically said, don't fire the children. Whatever you do, please don't fire the rest of the children. Keep them working in your factories, in your sweatshops. And it looks like one of the ways they implemented it was basically they gave money to allow these children to go to school. But of course, that's just a temporary fix. That just applies to a select number of children. Now again, we're talking about child prostitution here. So this is a perfect example of unintended consequences. And when people get emotional, they say child labor is bad, let's get rid of it. They don't actually think compared to what? Why are these kids working in factories? Well, it's often because, again, it's either that or starve. It's either work or starve. That's it. It's unfortunately that's the case in a lot of these third world countries where there's not that much wealth throughout their societies, and that's the best they can do. Now, over time, if you just naturally let that go, if you try to maintain a free society to the best of that nation's ability, maintain a free society, over time, they will industrialize, life will get better. Over time, child labor will just naturally go away. The only reason we don't have child labor now isn't because of child labor laws. It's because we don't need children to work. We don't need children to work in factories. And imagine, okay, let's say we legalize now there are laws against child abuse, which I'm fine with. Laws against, hey, if a parent were to have a kid working on their own, say they start a business producing something and they lock their kid in their basement, starve them half to death, and make them work 16 hours. That's child abuse there. That's actual child abuse. That's something you don't really need a labor law for. You can just say, hey, this is parental abuse. You are abusing your child, and that falls under a whole different set of laws. Basically, we live in a society, because of the luxuries in industry and capitalism, we are at the point where we just don't need our children to work, so we don't. Because the vast majority of parents are like, okay, I don't want my child to work if they don't have to. But yeah, this is, I think, very important, because it's down to unintended consequences. Everyone is against child labor, so they automatically assume, okay, if I'm against child labor, then I'm for child labor laws. But that's not the case, because again, you had a bunch of people who wanted to help children, and because of what they were talking about, they didn't even implement it. Because what they were talking about implementing, children were forced to go from basically sweatshop labor, which isn't great, to even worse things like stone crushing, which I don't even know what that is. I guess just the whole, what you see in TV shows with prisoners, people just breaking stones with a pickaxe. I don't know. Stone crushing, street hustling, and prostitution, which, you want to mess up a child? Like, it's... I imagine working a child 12 hours a day is not good for their mental health, but child prostitution is a hell of a lot worse. So, again, that's my whole point of this. Like, unintended consequences are important, and that's why people get, and to the broader point, honestly, people get so emotional when it comes to laws. Like if I were a senator and I wrote up a puppies and kittens law, it's like, imagine how many people would get mad at the people that oppose that law because they were like, oh, you must hate puppies and kittens then. It's like, no, I can name the law whatever I want. Like, laws don't always do what they're intended. And again, we have to ask, compared to what? Like, you can't compare it to the ideal. You have to compare it to what will happen in a society if you put pressures on certain things. And honestly, again, it's like, why were they working in these positions? Well, because it was the best thing for them. It was either work in a factory or starve. And in this case, well, it was either work, period, or starve. And they figured, okay, instead of starving, I'll work. Or I'll put my kids to work. And they're like, okay, they put their kids to work. So what does that mean? They put their kids to work in the best job possible. Like, if you're a parent and you have that inevitable, you realize the inevitability that, okay, my child's going to have to get a job, even though they're 8, 9, 10 years old, I'm going to look for the best possible job. Even though it's not a great job, again, like, what, half $1 a day working in a factory, not a great job. It's still better than what? Child prostitution. And as they were saying at the end of this paragraph here, in several cases, the mothers of dismissed children had to leave their jobs. So, nowadays, what do we do? Like, what do most people do with their kids? Well, they have grandparents, or the kids have grandparents to look after them, relatives, friends. Some parents have babysitters for their kids. Some parents, of course, once the kid's old enough to be in public school, there you go. The public school takes care of them for those that put their kids in public school, or any school, I should say, at all, other than homeschooling. The school takes care of them for at least 8 hours a day. And it's like, this is another impact right there. Imagine, like, if you were stuck with imagine if all of a sudden the school was gone. It was like the school was just like, okay, we're not taking your kid anymore. Well, half the time the mother's going to have to, or the father, of course, but it looks like the mothers were the one that quit their jobs here. But one of the parents will have to quit their job to look after the child. And it's like, okay, there goes another source of labor, another source of income. If the mother quits the job, it's like, okay, so the mother quit her job. I imagine the father's still working. Hopefully it's a 2-parent household. But if the father quit their job, one of the parents quit their job, and the kid no longer has a job, well, basically I imagine they're on the brink of starvation, depending on the country they're in, especially looking at, like, Bangladesh. So that's the thing. Like, this is a very heartbreaking story, and it was all, like, child prostitution here was the result of people that meant well and tried to eliminate child labor. It's like, this is a very important thing to realize, that, like, you really have every single thing, every possible law out there, you really have to look at the consequences, because they're not always great. And just because someone is opposed to a law doesn't mean they're opposed to whatever you're fighting for. Like, again, I hope this shows you that, like, hey, if someone is opposed to child labor laws, it doesn't mean they're opposed, or it doesn't mean they're in favor of children working. Just like, again, with the minimum wage, it's like people get mad. They assume, oh, if you're against an increase in the minimum wage, you must hate workers. And it's like, no. Granted, they might be entirely wrong about the consequences that they think will happen. But at the very least, chances are they're like, oh, they probably mean well. So it's like the biggest, in my opinion, one of the biggest not the worst people, but the people that are doing the most bad in the world are the people that are like, oh, again, puppies and kittens law. I like puppies and kittens. I'll vote for that. Child labor law. I'm not even going to look at the impacts of the law. I'm not even going to inform myself even slightly on the issues and what can happen. I'm just going to vote for it because I'm opposed to child labor. Same thing with the people in the war on drugs. It's like, oh, I think drugs are bad. I support the war on drugs. And look how well that went. That's the most catastrophic failure in U.S. history. Or it's at least one of the biggest catastrophic failures in U.S. history. It's that simple, that just because you say a law should do something doesn't mean that things will work out for the best. You really have to look at the externalities, the actual effects. And good on UNICEF, because, again, I didn't read this entire report. I skimmed through it. Although, basically, from what I can tell you, good on UNICEF for saying that they don't recommend banning child labor. They did not recommend these child labor laws. And, of course, I have heard other situations. Now, this is just one source. I have heard other claims that a lot of the children died. Like, it wasn't just that they went to prostitution. It's that some of them actually died of starvation. And I don't blame them. So, I mean, that's the whole point of this. It's like, this is obviously a very emotional issue. Though, like, you just have to take the emotion out of it. You have to look at this and say, okay, what is best for the children? And instead of just thinking about it for half a second, okay, what's best for the children? You actually have to, like, again, look up stuff like this. This is something that I'm surprised not more people, like, talk about. Because I've only ever heard of it from, I think, one or two, well, honestly, probably only one source. And I originally got this from the Cato Institute, so I'll post that in the description. But again, this report itself is UNICEF, which, I mean, I trust to be relatively non-biased, especially in the case of child labor. But yeah, again, I'll leave the full report in the description. I'll leave the link to the Cato article that I originally got the source from, if you want to read that as well. But it's not good. That's all I can say. But let me know what you think in the comments. This is just one example. That doesn't mean that if you ban child labor in another country, it'll just go away automatically, or it won't result in this. Like, again, it all depends on the wealth of the country. Like, generally, if children don't have to work, if the society is wealthy enough that children don't have to work, they won't, for the most part. And then you don't even have to ban child labor, because it'll just go away automatically. And that seems to be what happened in the United States from what I've read. That it's like child labor started to go away, and then the U.S. government stepped in and were like, oh, we'll ban child labor. And at the time, like a very small percentage of kids were still working with terrible working conditions, and it was like, oh, and then they took credit for it, because that's what the U.S. government tends to do with things. But yeah, like the video if you enjoyed. Subscribe for more. Spread this around. If you found this was a very eye-opening, like, informative video. But yeah, leave feedback in the comment section, and thanks for watching.